Hey, this is Mike Diercksen from Proactive, and you're listening to the Building Bite podcast. Tune in as we spotlight our guest, Michael Pepe, Northeast Managing Partner at SDV Law. Our episode today spotlights how your insurance policy can help maintain project cash flow. For more information on this episode and others, please check out the Building Bite at www.buildwithproactive.com.
Welcome to the Building Bite podcast, a podcast for construction contractors, owners, and insurance professionals, where you can hear from the experts on key topics to help you be successful. I'm Mike Diercksen, Manager of Marketing and Business Development at Proactive. Our guest today is Michael Pepe, the Managing Partner of the Northeast SDV Law, which is Saxe Doernberger Vita. Michael, how are you doing today?
Good, Michael. Hi. Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, look, really excited to get jumping in here today, and thanks so much for joining the show. It's a pleasure to connect with you here. Before we get into our main topic, I'm wondering if you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got to where you are today at SDV Law.
Sure. So I'm the managing partner of our Northeast offices here in Connecticut. We also have remote attorneys in New Jersey and Massachusetts. And I've been doing insurance law for 9 years now when I joined SDV. But prior to that, I was a construction litigator. I worked for a boutique firm in New Haven, Connecticut, dealing with contractor disputes, mechanics liens, bond claims, all the good construction stuff. And I was able to pivot from that, take all that knowledge and transfer it to the insurance industry, where we do insurance coverage on behalf of policyholders. And, good portion of that is in the construction industry, just based on the nature of the industry and the types of claims that they see.
Excellent. Yeah, we've had Tracy on the show as well, so we're familiar with SDV, but love the work you guys are doing. Definitely a leader in that space. And so, Michael, a common thread for some of our recent episodes, just the understanding of material costs and labor availability, cost escalation, financial security remain these kind of contributing factors, right? With a spike within the construction market, generating greater notices of claims. Is that something that you guys are seeing on your end as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think all those factors that you mentioned, they're just making it more difficult for contractors to predict their costs when they go into a project. And, at the heart of it, that's what contractors have to do. They have to be able to predict those costs and then manage risk so that they can make their estimates and make money on their projects, and their projects flow smoothly. So I think with a lot of things out of their control these days, coming out of the pandemic, if it taught us anything, it's that there's those unknown unknowns that we can't predict, and they can blow up all reasonable expectations. So contractors are trying harder than ever to manage their risk, and they're having to do it on projects that were already negotiated, potentially, before the pandemic and the supply chain problems, and they're having to do it with insurance policies that may have been in place or negotiated or underwritten prior to some of these events. So struggling to work with some of the things that were already in place, and then looking forward to say, how can we avoid these types of issues in the future to better manage risk, which is what they're after at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's something that it strikes me in this conversation, Michael, is given your background and your experience here, I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of clue into some of our listeners here, because there's a little bit of nuance, right? Within this space, and you've done a lot of work within the SDI space, but you do have experience with insuredy as well. And I'm wondering, what would you say from a legal perspective would be the biggest difference between the two, right? Talking about these extenuating factors, but there's two clear lanes here of how to attack it between insuredy and SDI. What are you seeing as a difference there?
Right. Yeah. Really, really good question. First of all, surety is not insurance, right? It's a financial transaction where the surety is agreeing to guarantee performance of its principal, of the contractor or subcontractor. But if the surety has to make good on that guarantee, if they have to step in and finish the project, or pay money, or hire other subcontractors to basically, clean up whatever mess there is, it has the right to turn back to its principal and collect every single penny that it had to pay out. So it's not insurance, it's a guarantee. When you look at SDI, that is an insurance product, and it can work similarly to a surety, because the thing that it's insuring is a subcontractor's default on its contract obligations. But in exchange for a premium, the insurance company is actually accepting that risk. So in the case that the subcontractor defaults, the insurance company, the SDI carrier, will come in, they'll pay the cost to finish the job, after you use up the balance of the contract and you pay your SIRs, and it fulfills whatever obligations. And of course, I have to say those obligations are what's stated in the contract, and the terms, of different policies may vary. But practically speaking, what that means, the major difference that you see is that when a subcontractor defaults, the carrier pays, subject to all the exclusions and provisions of the policy. A surety is going to sit back and wait. If you make a claim on your subcontractor's bond, that bond is going to, first thing they're going to do, they're going to call up the sub, their principal, and say, did you do anything wrong? And they're probably going to say, oh, no, I didn't. They're withholding money. There's all these contract disputes. So the bond is going to sit there, and they're going to sit back and wait, and they're going to let their principal defend them from whatever claims there are, and they're not going to pay until that dispute is resolved. So unless your subcontractor goes bankrupt and they go belly up, you're more likely to get cash flow to finish that project in a quicker manner through an insurance product.
And that's a great point there. It's definitely a key distinction between the two. And that's what's going to dovetail nicely into our topic today, right? Which our topic is how your insurance policy can help maintain project cash flow. So we alluded to a little bit earlier, there's a lot of extenuating circumstances. Contracts have been negotiated pre-pandemic that are now, between material cost escalations, things are going up. It's getting challenging to do that. Cash flow is super important, right? It's a key driver of success for a project. So given the market conditions and everything we're talking about, specifically from a risk management team or a GC trade or the operations team, how are you seeing this affecting the cash flow?
Yeah, so first things first, because every insurance carrier is going to tell you this, nobody's insuring your business risks or insuring your cash flow, right? There's no product that says, I want to insure my project cash flow. But they're insuring the stated risks that are in their policy. The things that we see most insurance policies deal with are liability issues, whether it's a CGL, general liability policy, professional liability, pollution liability. There needs to be a claim, and then there's going to be a dispute about whether the policyholder is liable, and whether or not that policy actually has to pay for that liability. So when it comes to project cash flow, those types of policies aren't all that helpful. So you're typically thinking about, what are the first party coverages that I have that are available to me or available to the other players on this project, that we can submit a claim regardless of fault and get some money flowing back to the project quickly. So SDI, you mentioned, that's one of them, right? Because you say, we defaulted this contractor. They may be disputing it. That's in the background. But in the meantime, the policy's triggered. Money starts flowing after I use up that contract balance and my SIR to start paying for, whatever the losses are resulting from that contractor default. The other things you want to think of is, do I have property damage? If the contractor's default or not, there's property damage during the project. Is there a builder's risk policy, right? That's the first place you look for property damage. And that first party coverage, ideally the contractor and the owner are both insureds on that policy, and you make a claim for the property damage, business interruption, those types of losses that are covered on a builder's risk policy. What people may not always be aware of is the first party components of your property and pollution policies, which more often we see those together on a contractor's, CPPI, contractor's property pollution protective indemnity insurance. A lot of times, most of the forms these days have a rectification or mitigation part. And that's a first party coverage. And what it's designed to do is to cover your expenses to mitigate a loss before the claim comes in. So you recognize that, the geotech did a bad job, calculating the spans on some steel girders or something, right? And you don't want the owner to sue you for that. You want to go out there, you want to fix it. The rectification is available, but you have to be aware of how those coverages work so that you can access them quickly in the moment, before it turns into a claim, and while you still have the opportunity to protect that cash flow and protect your project.
Right. We've certainly seen some rectification claims in our experience, and definitely a dynamic product, but timing is crucial, right? Making sure you're responding right away and coming up with a game plan for doing that. So, Michael, one of the things we find, one of the easiest ways for our audience to kind of relate to these is through an example or a story. Can you give us a scenario where maybe you saw a breakdown or a lapse in coverage that hurt a project, or maybe a different time where those insured's internal guardrails kind of saved them from a significant cash flow issue?
Yeah, sure. And I'm a lawyer, so I'll start with the negative first. I always tell my clients, send me pictures of the projects that you complete on time and on budget, because I know they're out there. They're just never on my desk. And I want to, you remind me that the world is mostly good. But I have seen some of those, those negative experiences where, there's, maybe letters going back and forth between a general contractor, and we had a client who was a glazing subcontractor, doing all the curtain wall on a project. And, the letters weren't terribly specific. They just said you're behind schedule, and, didn't really do anything to respond at that point, right? And then it wasn't until months later that a letter comes in that says, hey, those shop drawings that we were asking you to submit months ago, well, now that we've started installing some of the things on the project, that there were issues in the design in those shop drawings, and now it looks like a professional services, right? A professional services, professional liability. Let's notify the carrier. And we had a client who, when that letter came in, notified the carrier like the next day. But what they hadn't done was recognize that when those earlier letters came in, that could have looked like, or at least from the carrier's perspective, those earlier letters, they said that ties to the later letter, and the whole thing was a professional service. Your project team knew that there were issues with these shop drawings, and the fact that they were late contributed to why they were wrong. And the carrier looked at that and said, this is a late notice issue, both on the claim. So they brought up a late notice issue on the professional liability side, but what they also said was your rectification coverage doesn't apply because it's too late. You already have the letter asserting you did something wrong, and they viewed their policy language, and policies differ on this, but they viewed their policy language as saying once a claim gets made, it's too late to access rectification coverage. So there were a lot of tricky issues in that case, and there was definitely some gray area in interpretation that our client and the others involved were disputing. But there's a clear takeaway there, that is, you have to understand how those coverages work and try to avoid the fight. Just give notice as early as possible. Right. So that may be a bad experience, but I think there's good experiences out there too that I've seen, on the SDI side, also on the rectification side, where the project teams know what they have to report up, whether it's to the risk manager, the general counsel, the insurance broker, whoever's really in a position to understand those coverages. You can't expect a project team to understand how insurance coverage works, especially this type of insurance coverage that's not the mundane everyday. But they have to know when they need to take their contractor hat off, right? They're trained to see a problem and fix it, to say, all right, I'm going to do what I can to make my client happy on this project and avoid losses and damages. But they need to know when they have to turn around and go up the chain internally to the person who can trigger the right insurance coverage that can help that out. And I've seen that work on big projects with clients who understand the way their coverage works, and they get notice right away. And when something happens, no matter how small it may look at that time, they're starting to think, what might be down the line, and what coverage do I need to trigger and get in place and notify in case it goes south. It's really those contractors that are really proactive and really understand their insurance coverage that can take advantage of it in the best way.
Yeah, I remember a conversation at the AGC Surety and Risk Management Conference down in Bonita Springs just about a month or two ago. And within that, there was a conversation about, well, hey, if I didn't want to provide notice right away because I'm afraid it might affect, my premium renewals and giving notice if it's not a claim. And pretty unanimously, as a very interactive conference, the carriers basically stood up and said, hey, look, we're never going to penalize you for providing notice early and fixing the problem before it became a bigger problem. That's a good thing. And that shows that partnership, right? So there's definitely an element of communicating in a timely fashion, make sure your team is turning that around. And as long as you're kind of all pulling in the same direction, that's what these policies are in place to do, is to rectify those situations and kind of streamline everything.
Exactly. Giving a notice on, a construction professional policy or an SDI policy, it's not the same as calling up your auto insurer and,
Right.
they're going to ding you because something might have happened, right?
Absolutely.
It's a partnership, especially at that higher level where large contractors and construction managers have, some have really long-standing relationships with their carriers and their brokers. So yeah, notice early, notice often, have an open conversation. That's going to be helpful. And it's probably the biggest thing that I can say to avoid some of these disputes on those types of policies, is being aware of what you have to do and keeping the carrier up to speed on what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, then, kind of leaping off that point right there, when it comes to advising your clients, what would you say is probably the number one thing you're looking for them to assist with their understanding, right? The situations and the coverage expectations.
Yeah, I think it's understanding how coverage works. I mean, I don't expect every contractor to be an insurance coverage lawyer or, a sophisticated insurance broker. Of course not. But have the people on your team that can help you with those types of decisions when it comes to placing coverage and when it comes to drafting your contract language that needs to dovetail with the coverage. And also when it comes time to be aware of claims and make notification of claims. I mean, another thing that we see is in the contracting, when the contracts were made in a vacuum from insurance. And I see this happen all the time, right? The lawyers are negotiating the contracts and the subcontracts, and they take the insurance, sometimes it's a separate exhibit. They take the insurance exhibit and they send it to, one sends it to their broker and one sends it to the other broker, and those brokers don't talk. And now you have a contractual shifting of the risk allocation that doesn't line up with the risk allocation among the insurers. And that can cause problems if it's not done properly. You're buying all this insurance for a reason, and through the contract, it's all getting paid for, right? Whether it's I'm paying for it, you're paying for it, or you're taking the deduct on the contract price. You're agreeing that all this insurance is going to be in place for the benefit of the project. All parties are, and if you go into it with that frame of reference, that we're all putting all this policy in place, whether you're buying it, I'm buying it, or otherwise, let's make sure that we're drafting the contract and then performing in a way. Our conduct works in a way that's going to allow us to access that coverage when we need it, because otherwise you're just wasting money on it, right? I've seen situations where the contract language created an issue where coverage that they purchased, both parties agreed was going to be there, and they couldn't access it because their contract didn't allow them to access it.
Yeah, no, great points there. And Michael, something you mentioned when we last spoke, some of your clients, specifically the GCs that you work with, in your opinion, what do you think these successful GCs are doing right now to safeguard against these market factors, kind of enhance their current standing within, as you mentioned, working with those brokers, working with the carriers? What are they doing on that end? And is the advice the same regardless of the size and the scope of the insured?
Good questions. I think on the risk management side and accessing insurance side, I think it's what I said. It's pre-qualing your subs, right? Having good programs, having good relationships with your subs, knowing what type of insurance they have in place, what type of risk management protocols and procedures, and what's their risk management philosophy, right? Are they thinking about things in a way that matches yours? I think that's sort of the business side of it. On the legal side, it's what I said is, what do the contracts say? What type of insurance do those subs have if you're not putting them into a wrap or you're purchasing it? understanding what they have. And you hit the nail on the head when you said, does it make a difference the size of the contractor? Absolutely, because my advice as a lawyer, sometimes I give that, perfect world advice is you should review every subcontractor's subcontract on every job. You should review their complete policy on every job and check it again at renewal. And not every GC or construction manager has the ability to do that, right? Or the cost benefit isn't there. So you have to think about what's going to work for you in your situation. Is it relying on, a wrap up to solve that problem for you? Is it in the markets where it exists going to a labor guard or similar program that has some of those features baked in? Is it, lower down the chain? Are you just looking at a cert checking service, which is checking the cert but not the policy? But you kind of have to figure out what the cost benefit analysis is based on the size of the project and based on what you can actually afford to do in terms of, those are all risk management activities on the construction side.
Right. In a perfect world, you're able to, there's all the time in the world to review and assess every time at every step. But we know that, it's a business and you're trying to maximize your time. And sometimes you're going, we're good with this. It's a risk we're willing to take internally, but it has the propensity to kind of come up and sneak up on you if it's not done frequently enough.
Exactly. And for some contractors, it might be, well, I'm going to review the subcontracts and insurance policies of these half a dozen subs who I use over and over and over again, and I'm going to do that once a year, but I don't have time to review all of them. And the key thing with risk management is always understanding the risk, right? So if you're not doing that, do you understand, like you said, what is that risk that I now have on my projects, on my balance sheet, because I didn't do that? And we're all business people, and we can all assess that, business risk a little bit differently. But if you don't understand it, then, you're walking blind through the forest. You don't know what risk you had.
Exactly. Well, Michael, this has been a really great conversation so far. And, one of the things we like to do for our audience is leave them with 3 takeaways from the episode. So what would you say the 3 biggest takeaways should be, keeping in mind that our audience is primarily contractors, owners, brokers, and insurance professionals?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say look at your policies and understand them. And if that means working with your insurance brokers, your coverage counsel, whoever you need to make sure that you have a good understanding of what your insurance policies cover and how to access them. The second thing is look at those notice provisions, because you need to know when you need to get those policies involved, those carriers involved, in order to help you solve problems. And then when you do those 2 things, I would write down what are some very clear instructions that I need to give my team that has no idea how this insurance works. How do I put it in their terms that say, when XYZ happens, you need to call up the risk manager, you need to call up the lawyer, you need to call whoever it is, so that we can take it from there. Because if those problems aren't getting to you as the risk manager or general counsel, you can't take the precautions and access the coverage that you purchased.
Right. The project team's day job is to build the project. So you have to give them the proper instructions and leverage to say, hey, we got to move this to a different desk here because this requires attention. What about an action item, Michael? So, if I'm listening to this and going, well, that's all great. I'm a GC, I'm trying to figure this out. What's my first step? Where do I go with this information? What's the first thing that I should look to do if I'm realizing maybe I need to view this differently?
Yeah, I think it's talking with your insurance broker, understanding what programs you have in place. There should be somebody in your organization who knows that. And if it's not, then, maybe you have an outside risk manager or an insurance broker who's on top of, what your corporate program looks like, and understand what is there, right? What's out there? How do these policies work in a disaster scenario? Where am I looking? And don't just pigeonhole yourself. I'm just going to go to the GL policy, or I'm just going to sue the subcontractor. What are all my options? That's what when we get a question from a client, whether it's a broker or a general contractor or an owner, it's okay, let me start with what are all my options. And now let's whittle that down and say what's most likely to work. What do I want to just put on notice just in case? And what do I really want to go after? But understanding your options has to be that first step.
Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier, these policies are bought and created in such a way to work for you, right? And so
Right.
kind of jumping to a conclusion in one way or the other before you really assess all your options, maybe there was a better fit that would have, you might choose one option and it creates more problems than that the other policy would have solved. So just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, and another thing that I should probably bring up is that in a tough market like we have right now, you may not be getting the same options that you had in years past. I'm seeing that happen as the market's tightened up in the last couple of years, and your coverage may work a little differently. And
Right.
if you're not aware of that and your team isn't aware of that okay, you don't have this endorsement anymore. They put this new endorsement that makes notice a little harder, or maybe eliminates coverage for this or that or whatever it is. Those things aren't static. So if
Right.
somebody worked on a claim 10 years ago or reviewed the subcontract 10 years ago, these are things that need to be looked at every couple of years.
Yeah, totally agreed. Well, Michael, before we let you go, we want to hit you with a couple rapid fire questions. First and foremost, what is it that keeps you up at night professionally, right? As a coverage attorney, what are the things that are haunting you there?
Well, I'm going to stay with the same theme. It's deadlines. As an attorney, and as a litigator, we have court deadlines, we have statutes of limitations, we have notice deadlines on policies, contractual limitation periods. That's the thing that always in the back of my mind is like, oh man, did I miss the deadline? Okay. So being aware of those, writing them down early, because we can't miss a deadline. So letting our clients know that as well, that be aware of what those provisions say and work them into your workflow and your policies and procedures so that you don't miss a deadline, because there's nothing worse than saying, if I told them 2 weeks ago I had coverage, but because I didn't, I don't have coverage. Like that could be $1 million mistake, could be a multi-million-dollar mistake.
Right.
So
right.
yeah.
No, definitely agreed with that. How about trends, right? Trends in the marketplace. You mentioned, it is kind of a harder market right now. Are there any trends you're seeing with regards to these claims, whether it's the frequency, the size, the propensity even for just filing the claims?
Yeah, I think, on some of these really big infrastructure projects, there's been a tendency for really large claims on the professional side there, and I think on the SDI side as well. In the hard market, carriers are always tough on big claims, but I think in a hard market, they're being tougher on certain types of claims. That doesn't mean every carrier, it doesn't mean every claim. There's certainly instances where we have great relationships with attorneys on the other side and carriers, and things get resolved that should get resolved. But in a tight market, I think it's fair to say that we see carriers taking a closer look at certain claims and really maybe digging in on things.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Michael, as you know, this is the Building Byte podcast. That stands for Building Insurance Technology with the Experts. You are today's expert. I'm wondering, I know you're based out of Connecticut. What are you taking a bite out of today?
So I'm in New Haven and my last name's Pepe. So it's always about pizza over here. We have the best pizza in the country. If you've never been to New Haven, come down, contact me. I'll take you out. And it's not just Pepe's is great. I'm not related, but Sally's is great. Modern bar. There's lots of good options around here, and all of them are better than pizza anywhere else in the country.
Have you done the clam pizza? That's the one I saw. There's a Netflix special about it. Is it good? I can't wrap my head around that one.
Oh, it's awesome. And you're from Rhode Island, right? I mean, you should be into the clams. No, clam and garlic.
I know. I was born in New Jersey. I don't know. We did it. We didn't necessarily do it that way, but might have to give that a shot.
Yeah, a little clam, garlic on a white pie, little lemon juice. Throw some crushed red pepper on there. Awesome.
Sounds great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for chatting with us today. If our listeners want to hook up with you, where's the best place for them to find you?
Absolutely, LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn every day. Try to post as much as I can as my schedule allows, but hop on there, send me a direct message. My email and everything's on there as well, but you can find me.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it.
All right, Mike, I appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Building Bite. This podcast has been brought to you by Proactive. Check us out on thebuildingbite.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media for all future The Building Bite news and updates. You can also find us on your favorite apps, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Amazon. If you have ideas for episode topics that we should cover on the show, or you know somebody who would be a perfect guest, let us know at connect@thebuildingbite.com.